Is there a verse in the Bible that disproves the Genesis gap? A single verse that makes it impossible to exist? Today we'll look into this issue. Welcome to Discerning Truth. This video is part of a series dealing with the Genesis gap and how it represents what we believe to be a wrong approach into Bible study, a faulty approach in determining true Bible doctrine. If you've not viewed the first video in this series, please do so because it speaks of our purpose and goals in these messages and details what we hope to achieve. We'll take a look at a page that we wrote several years ago about the Genesis gap that deals with this topic. But first, we need to establish some key study principles, or at least remind ourselves of these key principles to help us understand how to look at this passage. And one of the very first and foremost key Bible study principles that one should follow anytime he reads the Bible is that explicit statements always take precedence over implicit statements. Now, of course, explicit and implicit, when you're using them concerning statements, are opposites or near opposites. For instance, if someone says that they don't care for spinach. Say, I don't care for spinach. Well, now, what kind of statement is that? Well, it implies that they don't want spinach. They don't like spinach. But if they say, I do not like spinach, that's explicitly stated. See, to imply something is kind of to hint at it. To directly state it is to state it explicitly. And in the Bible, explicit statements, that is statements that are clear and plain to understand, always take precedence over implicit statements, that are statements that are not as clear or just hint at something or suggest something. Suggestions or hints are not explicitly stated. And that leads to the next principle. Bible statements in context always take precedence over statements apart from context. Now, this should be obvious. You always keep a statement within the context of the words around it. You interpret it or understand it from its surrounding words or context. You can find the same statement somewhere else separated from the context, but that does not give it its true meaning. You must keep it with its surrounding context. And then number 3 is all we'll look at right now. Explicit Bible statements in context are the pinnacle of indisputable fact among those who believe the Bible. That is, if you have a Bible statement within its context that is clearly and plainly stated and understood, that is the pinnacle of fact in the Bible. That is how you determine Bible facts. For instance, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. That explicitly states that God is the creator. It explicitly states that he created heaven and that he created earth and that he did it in the beginning. There's no hinting. There's no roundabout speaking. It's explicitly and factually stated. So there is a perfect example. But now, we will look at one verse in the Bible that is full of explicit statements. And if you're going to undo this verse, you have to find a way to undo the explicit statements, which is no small task. We look here, you'll find the very last verse in Genesis chapter 1, and it says, and God saw everything. Now look at that. Everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. He saw everything that he had made, and it was very good. The evening and the morning of the 6th day. Now, that is 3rd grade, maybe 2nd grade English. It is as clearly stated as you could state it. God saw everything. Now, the Gappists cannot let this stand. They cannot let every mean every. And it says here, behold, it was very good. very good. You'll find in other places he just says good. Here it says very good. So, what do we understand from this? What's the context? The context is the creation from the whole chapter of Genesis 1. The context there is what God has made. And we went over created and made. And if you want to look at that again, go to Nehemiah 9:6 and see what God made there. No, made means everything. It doesn't just mean the things that he recreated. We'll get into that in a minute. The Baptists will say, well, made just means what he recreated. Now, we'll get into that in a minute. They're not dealing with the text explicitly. It says, and God saw everything that he had made, and it was very good. Now, this brings us to some conclusions that we can draw. Let's go back to our page here, and let's put this Bible study into practice, the explicit statements into practice. Let's gather some facts, and we can determine facts. We can determine from the explicit statements in Genesis 1 that God created the heaven. Fact. God created the earth. Fact. God created light. Fact. God created darkness. Over in Isaiah 45:7, it says that he created darkness. God created plants. God created animals, both sea life and land animals. God created man. God created all the host of heaven. It says in Genesis 2:1, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. That's the host of the heaven and the host of earth, that the inhabitants. And then it says God created everything in Colossians 1:16, for by him were all things created that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible. Whether they be thrones or dominions or principles or powers, all things were created by him and for him. And then we know that God finished his creating on the sixth day. These are all emphatic, explicit, factual statements you can take to the bank if you believe the Bible. If you believe words have meaning. Now, we consider again the statement we just read, verse 31. And God saw everything that he had made. What's the everything? Everything we just looked at up here. Heaven, earth, light, darkness, plants, animals, man, the host of heaven, all of that. He saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. So the heaven is very good. The earth is very good. Light is very good. Darkness is very good. Yes, it is. Darkness is the swaddling band. Remember that message? Darkness is the swaddling band around the deep. Animals are very good. Plants are very good. Man is very good. The host of heaven is very good. Everything is very good. Now, for everything to be very good, there can be no hint of corruption, no hint of judgment, no hint of negativity in the entire chapter. Creation is a positive thing. It is not a negative thing. There is no hint of anything negative whatsoever in Genesis chapter 1. There cannot be a devil. There cannot be a curse. There cannot be judgment. There cannot be any sin or even the remnants of sin. Everything is deemed very good by the righteous creator of heaven. This simple, explicit statement as it stands, which can be understood by a grade schooler, blows a hole in the gap theory a mile wide. It decimates the claim that Lucifer and other spirits were cast down and the world destroyed before Genesis 1:2. It destroys the argument that darkness is a result of sin and judgment. If there is a fallen devil and his evil horde in any heaven or earth, if they're in anywhere, in heaven, anywhere in the universe, if it's enveloped in the darkness of judgment, then how in the world could the Lord say that that is very good? He can't. Those who believe in the Genesis gap cannot allow this simple and straightforward meaning to stand. They insist the devil existed way back there before Genesis 1-2, and that he was present in creation, so they must find a way to reconcile their claim with this explicit truth in Genesis 1:31. What are the reasonable and scriptural methods one can use to challenge this statement? There are some. We'll look at them. There are actually 5 different ways people could challenge the statement of Genesis 1:31, the explicitness of it. We'll examine all 5. The first way someone can challenge an explicit statement in the Bible or anywhere else, the very first way, is they just simply find another explicit statement that limits or somehow modifies the first explicit statement. Now, that happens all the time. This happens everywhere. And I'll show you one example in the Bible where this happens very plainly and clearly. We look here in Genesis chapter 2, and you'll see in verse 16, the Lord makes a very explicit command to Adam and Eve. In verse 16, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. Now that is explicitly stated. He says you can eat of everything. You can eat of everything that's in here. I made it for you. You can eat of it all. That's an explicit statement, plainly stated. But right after that, there is an exception made in the same context, in the same breath actually. Then he says, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. That's another explicit statement, very plainly stated, that modifies the first one. The first one says you can eat everything. The second one says everything but. And that this is valid. This is valid reasoning. This is a valid way for one to challenge an explicit statement. So, all the Genesis Gap believers have to do to undo Genesis 1:31, where it says everything was very good, all they have to do is find another explicitly stated statement anywhere in the Bible that is in the creation context. Remember, this verse, our verse, is in the creation context. All they got to do is find another verse in the creation context that modifies Genesis 1:31. They haven't found one yet. The next way that you could dispute an explicit verse, and this is the avenue they mostly try to use, is they dispute the context. And they'll try this route and they'll say, well, Genesis 1:31 only applies to the 6th day of creation. Now, different Gappists treat this verse differently. Some will say it only applies to the 6th day. Some will say it only applies from Genesis verse 1, verse 3 onward. And others will come out and say, rather smugly, say, well, it only applies to things that God made and not to things he created, which is nonsense. But some of them will come up and say it only applies to the 6th day creation. And this is dubious on its face. Because, anyone that reads the passage can read that last verse is a summary type verse. It's speaking about what God has made, and it's everything he made and what he thinks of it. And it's everything that is in the context of that whole chapter. From the ancient Hebrews on, it's been generally understood by everyone that he's referring to the whole creation week. In 6 days, God made the heaven and the earth, and that Exodus 20:11. That's what it's referring to, and God was happy with all of it. This understanding fulfills another key principle of Bible interpretation. It says, when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. And that is common sense. When you read that verse, you don't have to stretch anything to understand what it says. There is no hint that the scope of the statement should be limited. There is no hint anywhere that it should be limited. Also notice that the word behold in the verse. This is another difference from the previous good decrees. It shows an added emphasis on everything the Lord saw and on the decree. So, behold, he sees it all. He says, look, behold is the look. Look at all that I have made. Look at all that I have created. And another reason here is, since the Lord had only made one additional thing since his last good proclamation, if you'll go back and look at the passage, let's look there just briefly. You go back and look at the passage. Let's go back to chapter 1 and verse 31. You'll see that actually the fifth day ends in verse 25. First verse 22 and 23. And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And then in verse 24, he starts, God said, let us bring forth the living creature after his kind and all that. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after his kind, and everything that creepeth up on the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. See, this is all on the sixth day. This is kind of like the morning part of the day, so to speak. God made all these animals, and he says it's good. He made a good proclamation on the sixth day already. And then it comes on and says, and God said, let us make man. You know how that goes. He proclaims he's going to make man. In verse 27, he makes man, and then he blesses man in verse 28. And verse 29, he says, behold, I've given you everything to eat and all of that. And verse 30, and he gives them to every beast of the earth, every fowl of the air, and every creeping thing upon the earth, there is life. I've given every green herb for meat. And it was so. So, here God made everything else that he made on the sixth day and said it was good. And then he just created one thing after that. Just one thing. So how does one thing be considered everything? See, that doesn't make sense. God saw everything, not just one thing. He just created man. That was it. No, everything refers to the entire week. That is obvious. If people can't see that, they don't want to see it. Then, as we mentioned before, in view of this, some will concede that the very good statement covers the whole week, but it only includes things made from Genesis 1, verse 3 onward. Anything previously must be excluded. Why? Well, you have to get the gap in there. You have to, by all means, just somehow leave that gap in there. They insist on this way so they can slip in the creation and the fall of Lucifer and all of his angels and hosts before verse 2, and then pretend God didn't declare him good. And any objective person can see that this is a manipulation of the text. Do they actually expect a person to believe that Satan and his demons could fill the high places with their spiritual wickedness, as it says in Ephesians 6, and the Lord still say everything he created was very good? That stretches comprehension. All of the heavens and everything is just permeated by all this evil, but then God comes back and says, yeah, it's all good, everything's fine. No, that doesn't make a bit of sense. The straightforward picture of Genesis 1:31 presents is God is beholding everything he made, not just some things, and says it's very good. There is no sound, contextual, or explicit reason to limit the scope of these words. Now, another tactic that they will use, and this is number 3, is they will try to dispute the meaning of the words. Now, they really have a trouble with this one because these are very simple words. I mean, people could say, well, good doesn't really mean good, or every doesn't really mean every. I've never really encountered a Gapist that will use this tactic because they know that they would look like fools if they tried it. Everyone knows what every means, and everyone knows pretty much what good means, and especially very good. If you look up where every is found in the rest of the chapter, And that God created great whales and every living creature that moveth. Well, does that mean all of them? Does that mean every creature? Yes, it does. So they will not try to limit the meaning of the words or to change the meaning of the words, even though they would like to. Another tactic they will use is they'll try to claim that it's that to explicit statements. I mean, even though Baptists don't try this, but if you want to challenge an explicit statement, say, well, the words are really a figure of speech and should not be taken literally. That's possible. That's possible, and in some cases it's valid. But no one tries that in Genesis 1 through 1. That's not a figure of speech. There are no figures whatsoever hinted or implied. It just states emphatically that everything was very good. And that tactic won't work. And then the last way, and these are really the only 5 ways that you could modify that verse. The last way is to challenge the whole method of reasoning. Just try to say, well, explicit words just shouldn't be adhered to first. Explicit statements really shouldn't be the epitome of fact or truth. Well, if they do that, the entire Bible's in jeopardy. If you try to say that explicit statements should not be held as indisputable fact, well, then your salvation is in question. How do you know you're even saved? The statements that Jesus Christ made, and we find in the Bible about your salvation and about you having redemption and holiness and all that, and belonging to the Lord and justification. Well, if 131 can be modified because of that, and you can challenge the reasoning there, why can't you challenge the reasoning in the others? You can't. You destroy the whole foundation and basis of Christianity, and actually of reasoning and understanding of the entire English language. I mean, there's a place in the Bible, there's a passage in the Bible where people and some believers wrongly inferred a belief from something that the Lord said. Remember over in John chapter 21, where it speaks about Jesus saith unto him, if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me. Then went this saying. Now here he's speaking about how the believers at the time were trying to read something into the Lord's words. Then went this saying abroad among the brethren, that disciple should not die. Yet Jesus said not unto him, he shall not die. But if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? The brethren wrongly inferred Peter would not die. But Peter himself corrects them by reminding everyone that the Lord's words were a conditional statement that started with, if I will. It started with an if. Should a statement like this be placed on the same level as the explicit declarative statement like John 5:24, where the Lord says, verily, verily, I say unto you, he that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me hath everlasting life? See, one was inferred, the other was explicitly stated. The answer is obvious. Implicit statements can be misunderstood. Explicit statements are clear. And if you try to weaken an explicit statement to the level of an implicit statement by challenging the reasoning of explicit statements, then you weaken every statement in the Scriptures. We've just looked at one verse, one explicit verse, and it has destroyed the claims of the gap theorist. The statement is so clear and plain that one must have an ulterior motive to try and overthrow it. The statement simply will not allow anything that is not good within the scope of creation. It does not say that a gap is not possible, only that anything that happened before, during, and after any alleged gap must be very good. And this is where it really hits the fundamentalist or Bible-believing gapists. You could have a gap there, but it has to, everything within it has to be very good. And that will not fit the whole scenario that the fundamentalists and others have put in the gap. They put a whole world of evil in there and sin. It will not fit. But the Genesis gap is a prime example of a doctrine based upon inferred beliefs and implicit statements. It essentially has no biblical statements, explicit biblical statements to support it. Its proponents insert their inferences from Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, 2 Peter 3, and other places into Genesis 1-2 because they can't find a better place to put them. But they are trying to force implicit into explicit, and it won't work. And here are just a couple questions for our Gapist friends out there and concerning this. And if you can answer these questions, well, send them along. What explicit scriptural proof can you produce that limits the scope or context of the words everything or very good in Genesis 1:31 to align with your view of the gap theory? All we need is one. It has to be in the same scope, in the same context of creation, and it has to also be an explicit statement that modifies Genesis 1:31. If you find it, you send it along. And what explicit scriptural proof can you produce that changes the normal meaning of the words everything and or very good in Genesis 1:31 to align with your view of the gap theory? But you have to use Bible to do it. So if you've got those verses, if you've got those proofs, you send them right along. In the meantime, we're going to take Genesis 1:31 at face value and believe that it means exactly what it says.